As Labour reaches 100 days in power, Keir Starmer's new Council of Nations and Regions will meet for the first time in Scotland this week. Tonight we're in Perth, where the SNP have just won a council by-election in a seat previously held by Labour. So what are the big issues here in the gateway to the Highlands on the banks of the River Tay? Let's find out. Welcome to Debate Night. Debate Night is the only show in Scotland where you get to ask the big questions, answering them on our panel this evening. Kezia Dugdale is the former leader of the Scottish Labour Party. She's now Associate Director of the Centre for Public Policy, which last week issued a paper on a possible way forward on the constitutional issue. Patrick Harvey is co-leader of the Scottish Greens and MSP for Glasgow. He was also the former Minister for Zero Carbon Buildings, Active Travel and Tenants' Rights until the Butte House Agreement collapsed 6 months ago. From the SNP, the MSP for Perthshire South and Kinrossshire, Jim Fairlie. Before politics, Jim founded Scotland's first farmers' market here in Perth. Before building a successful food and events business, he's now the Government Minister for Agriculture and Connectivity. From Scottish Labour, Marra. Michael joined the party as a teenager and was elected to Holyrood 3 years ago. He's now the MSP for North East Scotland and the party spokesperson for finance. And finally, from the Scottish Conservatives, Alexander Stewart. He's the MSP for Mid-Scotland and Fife, and he's the party spokesperson for local government and public finance. Before becoming an MSP, he was a local councillor here for almost 20 years. Please welcome them all to Debate Night. And of course, welcome to our studio audience here in Perth. It's great to have you with us. And you can join in the discussion from home, wherever you happen to be in Scotland tonight. BBCDN is the hashtag you need right now on social media. And our Debate Night podcast will be available for you to download straight after the show. So let's get started. We've got a lot to get through tonight. And our first question of the evening comes from Jennifer Poutney. Good evening, Jennifer.
Hi, hi everyone. Given Labour had a chance to stand with the working people, why are they perpetuating the bad habits of Tories with perceived dishonesty? I feel completely disillusioned, let down by the UK, and do not see a future in the UK for me or my family.
Thank you, Jennifer. 100 days in power for Labour this weekend. It's been a troubled honeymoon, to say the least. Former Minister Brian Wilson has described the start as inexplicable. Michael Marra.
Well, it has been some difficulty, clearly, in recent days, and you've seen some changes that the Prime Minister's made at the core of his team. But he's absolutely determined to make sure that we get as much right for the country as we can and deliver the change that we've promised to the country across the whole of the UK and Scotland. But I do think there's many good things that we've done as well.
These difficulties, though, are they why you're losing by-elections in Perth and Dundee?
Well, the seats in Perth and Dundee actually were held in terms of the 22 election by the SNP. There was swings to Labour in both of these seats, so that's the reality in both locations. But we saw swings to Labour in both of those seats against the 22 results, and quite strong ones at that. So we want to make sure that we can focus on that delivery record. We can focus against the delivery of GB Energy. We've got the New Deal for Working People in legislation coming this week. We've stopped the Rwanda scheme.
About, Michael, I mean, did you imagine when you got into politics yesterday at Holyrood, you'd be voting in favour of cutting the winter fuel allowance for pensioners in Scotland? Did you ever imagine that would happen?
Well, some of these things are they are tough choices, and there's no doubt about that. But you have to consider that against the legacy that we've been left, and that is a clear, huge problem for the Labour Party across the whole of the UK. £22 billion, 22 billion pounds.
Pensioners.
Okay, so if I can explain, Madam, it's £22 billion of a black hole in year. So there's a long-term structural deficit the Tories have left for a Labour government or any government to balance that out.
Well, not just pensioners, by the way. You're attacking children as well at the moment because you're putting VAT on education, which is unheard of across the whole of the EU. Yeah. Unheard of.
Okay,
and there's children being affected by that.
All right.
So this isn't just, you know...
OK, yep. Let him respond to that.
So the situation we face is there is a very significant problem in terms of the public finances across the UK. We know that there's been a massive black hole left by the Tories, and we have to take difficult decisions to do something about that. We're yet to have a budget. There'll be a budget at the end of this month. And I work closely with the Chancellor, Rachel Reeves, and I'm absolutely confident that we're going to see better news in lots of different areas in that budget. But of course, alongside it, there will be difficult decisions that have to be made. That is the legacy we've been left. And what we have to do is make sure we can get the public finances back in order and try and get growth back into the economy. And it's absolutely critical that we do that. And we think in doing so, it's right that people who have more money, the broadest shoulders, can carry a bit more of that weight. And that's a big part of the solution. That's why certain taxes have gone up that people have talked about. It's why we have to make sure that we can try and get the money so we can pay for the public services that we need, and then we can start to deliver that change that people are so hungry for.
Hang on a second here. Do you think you need to be better at getting this message across? Because it's clearly not working at the moment, is it?
Absolutely. We have to make sure that our communication of the whole agenda that we've got has to be better.
Okay,
absolutely agree.
All right. Well, let's hear from the gentleman on the front row here. On you go.
I mean, let's assume there's a black hole. Yeah. Right. What I don't understand is, why didn't you save the announcement on the winter fuel allowance to be part of the budget? What I don't understand is why you came out so fast with that policy rather than waiting to make it part of the budget and we see the whole package.
Michael, I'll let you pick up on that. Let me just get one more. The gentleman with his sleeves rolled up. Yes.
Michael, yeah. It could well be a case of it's something that was just a badly timed announcement, but at the same time, the Labour government chose to retain the two-child cap, which is outrageous, and let bankers' bonuses continue to be unlimited. Yeah. You talked about putting burden on the shoulders of those who have the most, and yet you've done exactly the opposite.
OK, just respond to these 2 points,
Absolutely. So we haven't had the budget yet. It's absolutely clear. But there had to be so many of these decisions in the longer run. We want to make sure we're absolutely focused on tackling child poverty in Scotland and across the UK. It's what Labour governments do, and I would stand on a record any day of the week on that in terms of the last time we were in government, and we will continue to make sure that we do that in this Parliament without any shadow of a doubt. If I can say to the gentleman at the front, there isn't a doubt that there's a black hole. The OBR have said that actually the Tories covered up the numbers, didn't tell them about the fact that they had spent the reserves 3 times over in the first quarter of the year. I mean, it's astonishing, the state of the public finances that were left for the Labour government.
OK, all right. I want to take this around the rest of the panel. I mean, Jennifer's complaint was about being disillusioned with politics and dishonesty with politicians. The SNP have had their own problems with honesty as well, Jim Fairlie.
Well, let's go back to the point that Jennifer actually made, and that was the fact that she is utterly disillusioned with a Labour Party, that Scotland would have expected a Labour Party to deliver the kind of policies that would fit here in Scotland to the kind of country that we are. I'm going to correct one point that Michael has just made. Be under no illusion, it was a Labour sitting councillor who was sitting here, who was elected to Westminster, who voted for the winter fuel allowance to be cut. And as a result of his election, we had a by-election in Perth, and the SNP won it.
But they came first in 2022.
Hold on a wee second, Michael. I never interrupted you, so please do me the same courtesy. It was a Labour MP who's won his seat in London. He voted with the government to impose the winter fuel. And then we went out on the doors and we chapped doors day and night. And the one thing that came back to us time and time again was, I cannot believe that the Labour Party have done what they've done. They were absolutely devastated, because people who did go from SNP to Labour thought that they were getting the Labour Party that used to be, and it's not. It's a different party entirely. As a result of that, Michael and his colleagues, and I have a degree of sympathy, to be perfectly honest, because they can't control it, and that's why we're in the position that we're in, where Westminster tells Scottish Labour, or Labour in Scotland, this is what we'll do, and this is what you shall deliver. Now, to be fair, there were a number of Michael's colleagues yesterday, unfortunately Michael wasn't one of them, who voted with the SNP, or abstained, on asking the UK government to reverse that decision. Now, we'll find out in the budget if they're going to. I doubt it, but that was the ask of yesterday's debate, and there was 2 of them who voted with us. I give absolute credit to those 2, but there was 8 who abstained, and it's going to cause the Labour Party an enormous problem for the very reasons that I want independence. So that when I come to you and say, I'll give you a promise that these are the things that I will deliver, and then I can come back to you with absolute legitimacy and say, I can't do that because Westminster have said no, That's the position that Labour are currently in. And that's why I want Scotland to be an independent country.
Kezia Dugdale, do you think... do you agree with Brian Wilson? Have the first 100 days been inexplicable, as he put it?
I think the word I would go for is suboptimal, as the kids would say. I think it's very easy to put all politicians in the same basket and say they're all as bad as each other. Proportionality matters a lot here. This is not the Greensill scandal, this is not the PPE contract scandal, but it's not ideal. There's lots of polling out today, actually, that show us that the country is broadly just really disappointed. I think we're feeling that in the room, and I think that's almost an inevitable result of offering big change, people being fed up after 14 years of a very difficult life, not seeing that change straight away. And the combination of the freebies and the winter fuel allowance leads people to being really disappointed. That said, if you don't mind me saying, there are some really great things Labour have done in the first 100 days that have been eclipsed by all this stuff. And just to reel off a couple of them, the response to the riots was really assured and important. We are about to see the biggest ambitious increase in workers' rights. That's really welcome. The English railways have been brought back into public ownership. That's a really good thing.
Well, what about Sue Gray, resigns as Chief of Staff and becomes envoy to the nations and regions? She's here on Friday, meeting in Edinburgh. When you were Scottish Labour leader, would you have welcomed an envoy to the nations and regions coming to Scotland to meet you?
It sounds a little bit like somebody's coming from a foreign country.
It is a little bit like that.
So I don't think that first word is helpful. I do think it's really good, though, to have somebody at the heart of the UK government that's interested and focused on making devolution work.
Have you sent her your policy paper suggesting a way forward?
I actually haven't, but I will do now, Stephen. That's a great idea.
Because is she not crucial to that?
Well, I think everybody in this country is crucial to working out what the future of our country looks like. It's not just a conversation for people that support independence. It's not just a conversation for people who are driven by a passion for the union. I want devolution to work. And actually, a Council of the Nations and Regions might be one way that after 14 years of devolution not working, because the SNP and the Tories are so obsessed with knocking lumps out of each other, that system can work a bit better. It's just an idea. I think it's a positive idea. It brings together people who are both yes and no. If I could just say one more thing, Stephen, to Jim's point, I think when we're having a conversation about the winter fuel allowance, we cannot lose sight of, in this amazing parliament that we've got, that's just marked its 25-year anniversary, that has a budget of £40 billion plus, that the Scottish Parliament could have chosen to do something about the winter fuel allowance. Now, he will say, we don't have the money. The amount of money it costs to deliver the winter fuel allowance is £150 million.
So the exact
Last year's council tax freeze was £150 million. Ultimately, it's about choices. They chose to freeze the council tax. They could have chosen a different path.
Come back on that.
So the £150 million that it cost in the council tax freeze, I stand by that, and so does the government. And the reason that we stand by it and doing it at that time was because people were in a crisis, a cost of living crisis, and well, we'll wait and see what your budget delivers, Kezia. And if it's a good budget and more money comes back to Scotland, then we'll be able to deliver the thing. There is very little difference. She's not part of the Labour Party, I'll just remind you, Jim.
I'm not a member for
that's fine.
5 years.
OK, but you were the ex-Labour leaders and you're defending them stoutly, which is as is your right. But we took that decision to freeze the council tax in order to protect people's incomes in their pocket. But the £150 million that you're talking about, there was some confusion. So actually, maybe, Michael, you'll be able to answer this. Ours is the £150 million that the Secretary of State for Scotland that was going to bypass devolution, because you say you support devolution, we're all about devolution. You were going to bypass devolution and give it straight to the local authorities, but then that disappeared. So where has that £150 million gone?
OK, well, I can tell you for sure that the £150 million that Kezia talks about is still in the Scottish budget. So that money was paid to the Scottish Government, and they decided to put it into the black hole that they've created. So they to actually put back in place the Fuel Insecurity Fund, which there was £40 million of extra money that came to the Scottish Government. They could use that money to pay for that right now. So that's an option. So that money has not gone. It's still there.
None of this is helping people in the audience who are at the sharp end of this. Man on the end of the row. Yes, on you go.
Just one for Michael. GB Energy, the details are a little bit sketchy at the moment as to how they're actually going to benefit. You know, where is its place in the market and how is it going to, benefit consumers in Scotland who are worried about energy prices.
OK, let me just pull in a few other views, because the other hand's up. Lady in the back row there, thank you. Yes.
The winter fuel payment seems to be so controversial. Now, I watched an article about it in Reporting Scotland yesterday, and ironically the next article was about climate change, as somebody trekked off into the Cairngorms looking for a patch of snow. Does nobody join the dots up here? It seems to be just being used as a political game of football. The people who are still most in need of it will receive it. And it was originally brought in by the Labour Party in 1997 because the most impoverished part of the community were pensioners at 29%. 20 years later, that figure dropped to 12%, so that money is more needed elsewhere. Ultimately, it's us, the taxpayer, who is paying these benefits. But if you have very wealthy pensioners, they're not all going to contribute that to charity. It's just been used as a political
football.
Yeah.
Thank you. A man on the front row as well.
Just politics is all about optics, and if you, on the one hand, your two-child cap, VAT, your winter fuel allowance, and on the other hand, you've got freebies being taken, which most people could never be able to afford. Surely that some politicians in Labour would be able to say, look, we've got to stop this, because it just doesn't look right to ordinary people that you're taking all this money.
Yeah, Patrick, Harvey?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's absolutely right. And, you know, from what we hear, you know, the number of thousands of pounds worth of glasses. How many pairs of glasses does Keir Starmer need, for goodness sake?
How many pairs have you got?
I think there's two. I've got these and some reading glasses, and I paid for them myself, absolutely. But, you know, the question that the other gentleman on the front raised about why this wasn't announced as part of a wider package where they could have said we're doing some good stuff and sorry, we're doing some bad stuff as well. I think that's a really interesting question. I don't think it's inexplicable. I think this was a government that was determined to show in a sort of macho way, we are tough enough to do right-wing things. We're not going to threaten you with a left-wing agenda. I think that's the whole story of Keir Starmer's Labour Party. During the election, the Greens said that we clearly need a change of government. We clearly need rid of the last lot, but there was a real danger of getting a change of government without a change of politics. And I think that's what we're getting now, a change of government, change of the cast of characters, but without the fundamental change of politics that the country needs. If that black hole, that extra 22 billion in year, was enough of a justification to say we're going to have to change some of our plans, why not change your plans on income tax and say, actually, people on very high incomes, we are going to have to ask them to pay a bit more, to pay their fair share, to build a fairer society.
So they are. We've been absolutely clear that we're closing the loopholes and non-doms. We're making sure we get money back from that as well. Well, we have to make sure that we have a tax policy that works, that we can actually support working people. We have to target some of that, and you talk about this in Parliament quite a lot, Patrick, unearned wealth. We have to make sure that we focus on how we get more money in.
But you rule out a wealth tax.
Is it a real challenge? Across the board, I spoke about this today in Parliament. Say, I'm quite open to talking about what the broader package of tax in the long run in Scotland is. I'm happy to have that conversation. I do that with your finance spokesperson quite a lot.
I hope that Rachel Reeves is willing to talk about a wealth tax, because so far she's ruled it out. I hope she's willing to talk about progressive income tax, because so far she's ruled it out. I understand, just briefly, I understand why a new government might want to under-promise, because they want to do that rather than risking under-delivery. This seems to be the first government I can remember that's determined both to under-promise and under-deliver.
Alexander Stewart, Patrick Harvey says there's no real difference between the Tories and Labour on some of this stuff. What do you think?
Well, Labour came in with an agenda of change. That was what they said they would do. And in reality, they haven't. They have disappointed thousands of individuals across the country in the policies they've had. Within 100 days, they have stumbled from disaster to disaster, whether it's happening in Downing Street, whether it's freebies, whether it's about people leaving or joining. All of that is causing them some real difficulty. But nobody thought when they stood for that election that they would attack the pensioners and take away their winter fuel. That was not on their agenda, but that's one of the first things they've done since they've arrived. And that has disappointed and decimated communities up and down the length and breadth of this country. And Labour are going to be stuck with that for some time to come.
Michael, final word on this?
I mean, I think some of what Alexander says blows my mind, frankly. He talks about disasters in Downing Street. This is the Downing Street where people partied while folk were dying in hospital, right? Where they were handing multi-billion-pound contracts out to their friends, right? Corruption on a grand scale, right? Of course, there has been communication that we want to get better, and there are policy choices that we have to make that are incredibly difficult because of the legacy, and the Tories purposely salted the earth in this regard. We have to get better at that. We will get better at it. But the changes we're already making on the New Deal for working people, improving people's rights, making sure we've scrapped the Rwanda scheme. For Patrick to say there's no difference is absolutely extraordinary. The Rwanda scheme scrapped on day one, the most abhorrent. And now we've got two people standing for the Tory leadership who backed that, extremists, frankly, and a competition between them. We choose between the people who think that we should cut the maternity rights of women and people who think that the children of asylum seekers aren't allowed to look at cartoons of Mickey Mouse. That's the kind of choice that would be asked. The idea we're not going to change is for the birds is not true.
You're disappointed by the start. Would you accept that?
No, I think it's a challenge. I think when you put up against what we've achieved in this first 100 days, against some of the issues, and the gentleman talks about communication and what some of these other issues look like, I would robustly defend the record of the changes that we've made in this first 100 days.
What I don't understand, Michael, is why you were surprised at the £22 billion black hole. John Swinney was in debates when Anna Sarwar was saying, read my lips, telling you that there was going to be at least a £20 billion.
I'll tell you why, Jim. These are two different things, okay? Yeah. There is the long-term structure... No, they are. There's this long-term structural deficit of £20 billion in the economy as a result of the lack of growth from both governments, from the SNP and the Tories in Scotland and across the UK. And that is this tax gap that is going to have to make sure we can mobilise our public services. The £22 billion was in this year. It's a different thing. And the OBR have said they weren't told about it. The Tories spent the reserves 3 times over in the first quarter of the year.
Okay.
Extraordinary.
These are big issues and big sums. I want to move on to a local issue next, right here. We're in Perth this evening. Next week, we're going to be in Kirkcaldy. The week after that, we're going to be in Glasgow. If you'd like to come along and be part of the audience for debate night and ask the questions, just go to the website, bbc.co.uk/debate night. Our second question of the night comes from Annie Goodfellow. Annie, good evening.
Good evening, everybody. What are your panel's thoughts re the news that broke yesterday about teachers striking at half-term? The children have missed such crucial schooling during the lockdown and kids need routine more than ever now. Plus, with parents who work and what are they going to do childcare-wise? The impact issues are huge.
Thank you, Annie. This is not teachers, it's non-teaching staff involved in this. The largest council union, Unison, has rejected a national pay deal, announced 2 weeks of strike action here in this area, Perth and Kinross, which could mean 4 weeks, in fact, because 2 weeks school holidays, then 2 weeks of strike action, 4 weeks children being out of schools. Jim Fairlie.
To say I'm disappointed is an understatement. So there were 3 unions were balloted on strike action. There was negotiations across all 3 unions. 2 of the unions have accepted the pay deal on the basis that it was what they asked for. All 3 unions asked for the same settlement. All 3 unions were given that settlement. The government has stretched its ability to be able to move money because we live with a fixed budget. And we were of the understanding that the unions had said, OK, you've gone as far as you can, we accept that, so now we'll take the payment and then we'll move on. So for one of those unions to now break ranks, as it were, and target this constituency, and it won't just be John Swinney's schools that get hit, it'll be my schools, it'll be your schools, with the schools that your children are going to, so it'll be you that is dealing with the after effects of this. I'm incredibly disappointed, and I would urge Unison to rethink, go back to work, and continue dialogue with the local authority, because it's a local authority decision, and make sure that our kids are not affected any more than they already have been, and put this to bed, because we've gone as far as we can as a government.
There is no more money,
no,
Jim. The message is there is no more money. This is not a negotiation.
It is not a negotiation. There is no more money. That's it. The pot is empty. So I would really urge the Unison members to have a think about this, because it will affect schools in my constituency. It will affect them in John Swinney's constituency. But the people who are going to be most worst affected, the worst effects will happen for our kids and for the parents who are going to have to try and manage this. It's not right, it shouldn't be happening, and I would very much urge them to go back to work.
Now, I know we've got teachers in the audience tonight and obviously parents and maybe other school staff as well. I'd love to hear from you on this. Alexander Stewart, what should happen?
Well, I think it's utterly appalling that a union are using the constituencies here, because that is going to embarrass the First Minister, and it's going to have a knock-on effect on Jim Fairlie's schools as well. But it's the children who are going to suffer and at the end of all of this. And as the individual has indicated in the question, what do parents do and what do carers do to manage that situation that's been forced upon them, just to try and make some political point scoring that seems to be attacking John Swinney and Jim Fairlie? These young kids have suffered enough that not getting the lessons they deserve and the support mechanisms they're involved in. And as I say, they're being held to ransom by a union that's decided that it is more interested in making the First Minister look embarrassed than the kids. So you know, this has to be sorted. I mean, really, to be in this position where a community in Perthshire is being targeted in such a way just because it's the First Minister's constituency and there is no regard for the youngsters and their education coming back and going forward.
Thank you. Chap with the beard in the back row, yeah.
Speaking as a primary teacher, I actually think it's laughable hearing the comments about the just disregard of where we're coming from with targeting areas and things. That's not on, like as you say, that's the unions. That's not to do with individuals. But quite often the way that's spoken of, it does come down to targeting people and individuals. Is this a ramification for the waste of SNP policies over the last decade in education? Because in my experience, there's a lot more going wrong than just pay disputes in education at the moment. Hundreds of teachers, primary school teachers, without positions, without jobs, basically on 0-hour contracts.
Yeah, you're teaching the kids. How do you feel about them being out of school for effectively a month? It could.
I mean, it's absolutely not ideal whatsoever, and it's not anything that any member of staff in a school would be choosing to do. But I think there's definitely a wider story there of underfunding across the whole education system at the moment. That you know, over and above the pay disputes that are going on.
Thank you, and chap in the front row as well.
Yeah. My wife's involved in this. Teaching assistants, as far as I'm aware, are only on slightly above minimum wage, but we expect them to do far more, almost to the level of teaching. And I think they actually deserve a big pay rise.
So you support the industrial action and what's taking place? Michael Marra.
It's first and foremost, it is really, really tough for pupils and for parents and for carers. There's no doubt about that. I absolutely support the right of trade unions to withdraw their labour in industrial dispute. And I have to say, this really does come back to the grotesque incompetence of the SNP government and their management of the finances over the last decade. I mean, we are, in 3 years in a row now, we've had crisis emergency cuts of hundreds of millions of pounds in the budget. We don't set budgets in the Scottish Parliament for a year anymore. We set them for 6 months until the Finance Secretary has to come back and pull it all out. I found out this week, the Finance Secretary told me in committee under my questioning, that she had underpriced the pay deals by £375 million on purpose this year. I mean, some of the incompetence is breathtaking. There's no doubt about it. And the problem that Jim, I think, in any of this has got is partly how bad as negotiators the SNP government are. Now, Patrick's been around the table with that a few times, frankly. And when they're told there's no more money, there's no more money. And they always find a bit more money.
Well, you just
and
found
we've just heard more of that
20% for junior doctors south of the border.
Well, absolutely. And that's, we have to make sure, we actually solved those disputes. We actually got people back to work. And that's part of what the job of government is, to make sure you can keep those public services working. But if I can say, the gentleman at the back as well, when he talks about the broad issue about what is happening in our education, the education performance in our schools is declining internationally. It's as a result of the complete failure of this government to reform education and to deal with actually the curriculum and the problems that are in it. We're just in the process of abandoning another education bill, and it's complete incompetence from the SNP.
Jim Fairlie?
So, I'm very much going to take the point on that you... I'm sorry, I forgot your name. I do apologise. You talked about whether or not, or how schools are working. I visited my old primary school the other day, our ladies' primary school, and I'm well aware that we have issues in schools. There's absolutely no question about that, and I take that on board. I also take on the point that the gentleman said there about classroom assistants. I'm always currently doing classroom assistant work in local schools in Perth, so I'm well aware that there are issues, as is the Education Secretary, Jenny Ruth. So the accusation from Michael, however, that this is incompetence and bad management. I've sat in the chamber now for 3 years, listening to Labour member after Labour member after Labour member coming in saying, we've done this and we can cost this and we can get you, you've got more money to do this and you've got more money to do that. It's dead easy. Well, they're now in government and they're now finding out it's not nearly as easy as you think. We put the pay award, or we put the pay negotiations to the unions and they accepted it. Everybody agreed that they were going to accept it. It was what they asked for, and we found that. Not because we're trying to avert strikes because that would look bad, but because we believe that people need the support in this cost of living crisis era that we're living in. So the government are pulling out all the stops at every turn. We get constantly criticised for not doing enough because we've cut something over here, but we're cutting something over here because we're paying people over here. Now, you all live with household budgets. You know that if you've got £1,000 at the end of the month to spend, once you start spending it, it disappears. So if somebody else then comes in and says, I now need you to pay another 150 quid for that, and you don't have it, what do? You move money around. That's what the Scottish Government does. So this nonsense that we're getting from Michael about incompetence, this is what working in a minority government looks like. When you hold on. When you're working in a minority government and you're trying to now balance the books and move things around.
Okay. For
so
3 years in a row, Jack.
Nonsense.
3 years in a row.
On you go.
3 years in a row, there's been crisis budgets mid-year because the government has made a complete mess of it.
So let me think about
That's not just me that's saying
what's actually
that's all
happening
the independent
in those 3
analysts.
years, Michael. Seriously, get a grip.
Kezia Dugdale?
So there's a little bit of truth in what everybody's saying here.
That's very diplomatic.
It's a wee bit more nuanced than this. So Jim, it is true that the Scottish Government had only ever budgeted for 2% pay increases for public sector workers. So Unison are asking for 5%. Yeah. You knew all along that the 2% you put in the budget wasn't enough to cover a reality where inflation's been at 11% and you've watched other people in other parts of the country get 5%.
But we went to 3.6. We went to 3.6, and that gives people an extra £1,300 or whatever's the bigger number. So the point I'm making, Kezia, and
I was going to do the other side, and you're already like...
Yeah. So they are working incredibly hard to try to get people the right amount of money in their pocket to give them the quality of life that they need. And we understand that things are really hard. It's difficult.
It is true that you could have planned for this better than you have. That's not the most killer criticism of the government in the world. It's just a fact. And I've got some ideas in this paper that we published last week, actually, about how structurally we do the Scottish Government budget. So you don't just have to do a one-year budget cycle, which, as Michael says, is actually only really 6 months because you've got all these extra pressures. That's a story for another day. A grown-up parliament shouldn't have to set just a 12-month budget. It should know how much money it's got 5 years hence, and there's ways and means of doing that. But can I say to the member in the audience, nobody wants to strike. And I tell you, nobody who's on nothing better than the national minimum wage wants to strike and give up wages. This is a failure of politics and political leaders of whatever stripe. And I actually think it's a good thing that the trade unions are taking targeted action. Because see, if they weren't targeting Perth and Kinross, it would be every school in the country that was out. We've seen what happens when all unions go out and the cost of that to the economy. There's a report coming out tomorrow to say that strike action alone last year cost the economy £3 billion worth of lost revenue, over 5 million strike days. We need to avoid strikes at all costs. The way to do that is to plan. And I think we can plan better than we've done so far.
OK, Patrick, I'll come to you in a second. Man in the very back row first. Yes, on you go.
Incompetence is right at the heart of the Scottish Government's education policy. It's been there for years. My wife is an a classroom assistant, and the behavioural management issues that she does for the minimum wage, and to sit here and, as you've done, and to condemn them tonight for taking action on that is vastly, vastly wrong.
Thank you. And lady in the blonde hair there, yes.
I was just, it's slightly different. I'm going to bring up the WASPy woman because you were talking about budgets and how you have to budget. And these women who are part of the WASPy have budgeted up to the age of 60 to have a decent and living standard of life. But now, because of the change, they are really struggling. And one of my questions tonight, and I've come in, is when will the WASPy women be compensated for those years that have been lost?
Okay.
Especially if they're on their own.
It
I
is
know
a
it's
subject
a different
we have
subject.
talked about many times on this
I'm only
programme down
bringing
the
it
years,
to the
and I don't blame you bring it to the point, but I want to make sure we get an answer to Annie's question here about this local issue here in Perth with non-teaching unions. Patrick Harvey, are they right to be looking at strike action?
I mean, my position on this is very close to Kezia Dugdale, actually. There is some truth on both sides of what's been said about the Scottish Government's track record, and that nobody wants to strike. No one should be happy about strikes happening in any part of our society or our economy, including the unions and those who strike. But I think it is pretty bad to have heard both government and opposition stigmatising the unions and blaming the unions for the situation alone, or even calling, as Jim did, for a union that's balloted its members actually to not go ahead with that. Their members have made that decision, and the union represents their members. That needs to be respected.
So what's gone wrong here, Patrick? Is it a failure of Scottish Government negotiation?
Well, there's two things. I think the Scottish Government does have a reasonable, a decent track record of doing its best to avoid strike action in the public sector. It's been most successful at that in the NHS, avoiding strike action, busting a gut, frankly, to find the money to have credible pay deals. But this goes back to far more than just the most recent intense cost of living crisis in the last few years. That's affected everybody. A great many professionals in the public sector delivering public services have seen their pay eroded in its value for 10 or 15 years. Yeah. So it goes back a lot longer. So it's very understandable why they're now saying, we don't just need a fair pay settlement in this year, we need the restoration of the lost value of pay. And that's not easy in the external pressures that do create those crises in the last few years. The thing that's different about local government, though, is we have this so-called tripartite system. So the local councils are the employers here, the unions are at one side of the table, and they expect the Scottish Government to break the logjam. The Scottish Government isn't the employer, but it has a responsibility to fund local councils. I think that situation has been shown to be causing far more problems than it solves over the last few years, where the councils point the finger at the government points the fingers at the council, the unions can't get an answer from either side, and we're going to need to change that. And one of the ways that we change that is by giving some of the Scottish Government's fiscal power to local government. At the moment, the Scottish Government is the one that can decide how much tax to raise and how to do it, and the local councils are left with a block grant that's fixed, and there's got very little flexibility in terms of what they can do to make decisions about how much money they can put on the table. We need to shift some of that revenue-raising power from the centre to the local government if we're going to have both of those around the table in future.
Your views on that and everything else you hear in the programme. The hashtag is BBCDN on social media. Let's go to our third question of the night, which comes from Karen McRosty. Karen, evening.
Good evening. If I could ask the panel, why here in the UK are we being pushed to use heat pumps, electric cars, when there's already a problem with the existing infrastructure not being sufficient for the supply that's been asked of it at the moment? We've already got housing estates that are not getting built because the national supply can't do it. Here in rural Scotland, an electric car is little more than useless in a rural setting. And why? Why are we pushing for this when there isn't the infrastructure?
Karen, thank you very much indeed. And electric car sales are down. We don't have enough people to fit electric heat pumps at the moment. Patrick Harvey, why are we pushing for it?
Well, the why is, I think, known to everybody. We are in a climate emergency. The world needs to reach net zero, and Scotland has finally this year recognised that we're years behind where we should be on reducing our emissions. Sorry?
So we're getting pushed so far, and yet there's so many other countries who are belching out emissions.
Well,
and you're trying to push such a small country and making it so difficult for us.
And you've just been talking about the cost of living crisis, which affects everyone here and their ability to meet these targets.
Every country needs to make the changes that are necessary to decarbonise our economy if we want the next generation to have even a viable chance of a livable world. So that's a challenge on all of us. We need to make it a just transition, and that means, you know, things like energy, things like transport. We can deliver those emissions reductions at the same time as cutting the cost of living. And actually, if you invest in energy efficiency as well as shifting away from gas, you're less subject to that wild volatility that we've seen in the last few years in the gas prices. Even those people who argue for more production of fossil fuels have to acknowledge that the global market sets the price of fossil fuels. We don't control that. So increasing production doesn't do anything to cut people's bills.
But what Karen's asking, Patrick,
energy efficiency, it's reducing demand, and it's decarbonising.
Are these demands on people realistic at a time that we're living in a cost of living crisis? I mean, the cost of the extra measures around the environment and homes, electric charges being put in, new building regulations.
These measures are realistic.
But they're costing £30,000 for every home that is built in Scotland
These
extra,
measures are
which is slowing down house
absolutely
building.
realistic if the government is willing to invest. And this should be the national infrastructure priority. Instead of, you know, road building that increases emissions and increases people's costs, actually, by locking in high-cost modes of transport. If this was the infrastructure priority for the country, you know, others have done this already. You know, you've got our neighbours in colder countries in Scotland with 2/3 or more of the country already using heat pumps or heat networks. And they're still expanding. They're still doing more of that. Because once you get the industry skilled up, once you gear up, once you scale up, once you get those skills in place, you not only create the good quality jobs that are necessary to get the work done, but you actually get an economic benefit and people paying less money.
5,000 heat pumps a year at the moment, and 200,000 have got to be our target if we're going to meet the targets.
It's been increasing from a very, very low base. It needs to carry on increasing from now right through to 2030 and beyond.
OK, lady in the black top towards... Yes, on you go. Yeah.
The Scottish Government wants us to use public transport to be able to cut down on, fossil fuels and stuff to help the environment. So why is the price gone up so much that it's... And there's no timetable as well. People cannot afford to use this, and there's not enough times to be able to get a bus or a train. So why is that?
Absolutely. And when the Greens were in government, we got rid of peak rail fares. We were taken out of government, and the Scottish Government have just brought them back again.
Here's a point of conflict. Jim Fairlie.
Oh, it's our fault, clearly. Listen, the peak rail fares reduction is not what the Scottish Government wanted to do. It comes back down to finances. Everything always comes back to money.
This sounds like the winter fuel allowance.
If there was a budgetary bonus that's coming back to Scotland when the Labour Party bring their budget in, we would gladly reintroduce that peak rail fare cut. However, we have got other measures in place to make rail travel as cheap as we possibly can. I can't remember the list of them, but it's seasonal, it's off-peak rail. There are various things that you can do, and I would urge you to go onto the ScotRail website and you'll find those. But our commitment to try to get people out of their cars and into public transport is absolute. However, I live in a very rural constituency. I've been farming for 30 years, and it is not that easy in a rural constituency. So one of the things we absolutely have to do is make sure that when we're having that discussion, we also keep a rural lens on that. But that's a different issue.
OK,
hold on one second.
Briefly.
One second. We've introduced the under-22 bus pass. We've got the over-60 bus pass. There's over 170 million... There's over 170 million journeys have been made by young people to get to work, to get to employment, to get to college, to get to see family. That's taking a huge amount of cars off the road, and we will do more.
All right, Jim, you made the point. Lady in the grey top with the glasses, yes.
I understand with the budget cuts and the issues and the finance and things, but the thing with the trains, that pilot, prior to the pilot, a student railcar ticket was costing £20 to Glasgow Queen Street from Perth during the pilot. No, sorry, before the pilot. After the pilot, during the pilot, it was £13.50. And after the pilot, it is now £26.50 on a student rail card. That is become we can't afford this.
Listen,
we can't afford this, and we are in a rural issue.
This is not something that we wanted to do.
But to get to the areas where the train even is, parents are having to spend because the buses aren't reliable and we can't get them to train stations. So already this is causing a problem on student rail cards.
Okay.
It could have been
Thank you very much. Young man down here, the glasses, yes.
Why do the SNP are so steadfast on investing in the A9 and the A96, dualling them, but there's projects such as railway electrification and the Highland Main Line is majority single track. Why is that not dualled? And that would open up the economy in the north.
Okay, thank you. We'll pick that up in a second as well. And man with the glasses here, yes.
I wonder, Jim, if you could share with us the costing, the costing research you've done in relation to reducing this or taking away the peak travel thing, what the difference is in people using the trains.
Yes, we did do a costing, and we're very well aware that it added a considerable amount to people's rail if they don't pick up the opportunities, and there are opportunities to get cheaper rail. Of course we did that costing. We're very well aware that this was going to have an impact, but it didn't do what we set it out to do, which was to get more people using the train so that it became self-funding, and it didn't do that.
So hang on, Jim, you made the point.
We didn't have the funding to be able to continue with it.
Is it possible that 7% uplift in the number of people who went back onto the railways might have been significantly higher if they'd known that there was confidence that that policy was going to continue? It's very difficult to get people to shift their travel patterns if they think that cheap fare is going to get ripped away from them.
No, Patrick, we had it for 6 months. It was extended for another 3 months, and it was extended again. We gave people plenty of opportunity. There was loads of marketing done around it. There was loads of marketing done around it. If you use this, we will continue.
All right, Alexander Stewart.
I mean, you know, everybody wants to do their bit to try and help the planet, and we know that. But what happened with the rail fares was a disaster. It's put more people back on cars. If you wanted any policy that was going to actually reverse what you are trying to achieve, you have achieved it, and you're putting more people into cars and at transport than on the trains because it's now unaffordable. And you cannot say, Jim, that it was a pilot that you thought wasn't going to work. It was never going to progress to the level everybody wanted, but at least the public got an understanding of that the rail fare was going to work for them, and they were going to be able to manage that for the future. And in reality, honestly, nobody in the government should be any wiser about what was going to happen here, because it's put more people back into cars and taken them off the railways.
Gentleman in the red and blue check shirt, yes.
Yeah, I think those that are behind those decisions of this green agenda should try spending a winter in Scotland out in the sticks and see what it's like where you need a wood burner to keep warm in winter.
Patrick Harvey?
I mean, it is the places that are off the gas grid, for example, where people are paying ridiculous amounts of money for fossil fuel to burn. That's where you're going to save the most amount of money by shifting to renewable heat. The huge opportunity that we see from some of the rural areas of the Scandinavian countries that have already made this change, once they see it working, they'd never go back again.
You get a power cut, what do you do? How do you keep warm?
That's one of the reasons why you want a decentralised grid, where you're generating some of your own energy. And the opportunity, for example, you talked about GB Energy. GB Energy might end up doing some public ownership in renewables, but it might end up doing it in a very centralised way. What it could do is invest hugely in community and local ownership of renewables, so that every community is generating the energy they need. You've already started
negotiating with the Scottish Government over their budget later this year.
Every political party.
Are these some of the red lines for you that we're hearing tonight when it comes to the environment?
Well, I don't particularly like the red lines kind of notion because it's a lot more complex, the Scottish budget. But very clearly, the Heat in Buildings programme, the programme of decarbonising the way we heat our homes, doing that in a way that cuts people's bills, that's a really, really critical part of it. And what we'd published in the last couple of years while the Greens were in government has been acknowledged by the UK Climate Change Committee as what could be a template for action across the rest of the UK. So it absolutely needs to be followed through with legislation, and it needs to be funded.
Okay, Michael Marra.
I think it's a real positive point that Patrick says about the potential for GB Energy to work in communities to build it up. You know, but I would say to you, Patrick, it wouldn't have happened at all unless we had a change of government. And what we are doing is making sure we're trying to answer as best we can that first question the lady asked about how we build out the infrastructure to make any of this possible. If we don't upgrade the grid as fast as we can't make any of this happen. We can't meet our climate obligations. We can't do the long-term reduction in bills that we want to see for people. But there's more decisions happened in these first 100 days of this Labour government to try and get that moving than there has been in 15 years. We have to make sure we capture as much as supply chain and get jobs from that as well. But I think the lady in her core question is right, that actually unless we make sure we get that backbone in place, we get the electricity available to people, and that takes the kind of step change in approach that the UK Labour government has taken.
Okay, a man on the back row.
Without long-term subsidies, solar panel and heat pump systems are not financially viable in Scotland. What we need is, like they've done in other countries, where you do have 2/3 take-up, is you have long-term subsidy plans in place. If you don't have that in Scotland, it's just going to be piecemeal, and it's going to be delivered to people on lower wages or lower incomes. You're never going to see the take-up that you expect.
Has anyone on the panel installed a heat pump? You have?
Yeah.
In your new home?
Yes.
Yeah?
Underfloor heating. The house is wrapped in a blanket.
And you're still waiting?
Well, I'm on the second floor of a tenement. And a lot of
That's the problem, isn't it?
A lot of tenements, what you're going to need is not necessarily an individual flat solution like heat pumps, but heat networks, shared ground loops. Again, this is not rocket science. This is not something that's science fiction. It's already being done, but it needs to be done on a much bigger scale.
Patrick, we don't have the manpower to put it all together. Yeah. We don't have the resource to put it all together at the moment. You're failing on the targets because you don't have the manpower to make it actually work.
So long as government invests and sends the very clear signal that regulation can send, that's what draws in the investment.
But that's not happening, Patrick. That's not happening.
It's happened with renewable energy. That's what happened with renewable electricity in Scotland. Government after government, including the Labour Lib Dem coalition, then the SNP, said we're going to set renewable energy targets, and lots of people scoffed. You'll never do that, you'll never do it, there won't be enough skills, there won't be enough. But by sending that signal, by sending it very clear signal, Scotland's serious about this, that's what brought in the investment. So that's what brought in the scaling up.
The targets are still being failed.
We need to do that with heat and
OK, Kezia Dugdale.
So I've got an electric car. It's one of the best things I ever did. I live in Fife, I live in Markinch. I can get just about anywhere I need to do that. It was expensive. There was no public subsidy. I earn enough money to be able to make that step. A lot of people can't do that. I have just gone through a process of trying to get solar panels on our house. And 12 panels on the roof of our house will cost us 15 grand. We haven't got 15 grand, and we're really well off. So I agree completely that you need public subsidy schemes to incentivise critical masses of people to make these changes.
Are the targets realistic at the moment?
They have to be. Like, we have to do this. Yes, with the right investment, yes, of course they are. We don't have the investment. And Alexander, if the government came out tomorrow with a big plan to invest in renewable targets, your government would be the first to oppose it. Your people would be the first to oppose it. You would say it's not the role of the state to make those types of
remember that
we all want to see energy conservation. We all want to take part of that process. But at the same time, you need to be realistic what you can achieve. If you don't have enough money to make them happen, and you don't have the staff and the manpower to put it together, it won't happen.
All right, hang on a second. Patrick Harvey.
He rolled back on lots of net zero policies Rishi Sunak did in the tail end of the last government. And he said, what we want to do is to make the transition more affordable for people. The one centrepiece, if he was serious about that as the objective, the one centrepiece would be break the artificial link between what people pay for electricity and the price of gas. Scotland is generating cheap, clean, green, abundant renewable electricity, but you don't get the benefit of that in your bills. It's the cheapest energy to generate. It should be the cheapest energy to consume. And if the UK government, the last UK government, had been remotely serious about wanting to help make the transition affordable for people, break that link, cut people's electricity bills right now and give them an incentive.
Gentleman with his sleeves rolled up, who's desperate to get in here. On you go.
Yeah, so a couple of things here. One is, if we talked about unions earlier, there's a paper by Unite that talks about the energy sector as a whole. The energy sector made 30 billion profit in the last financial year that they analysed. The net cost of nationalising that would be 60 billion, e.g. 2 years' profit. You offer me that as a businessman, and I'll take your arm off for it. So we know where the money's going, folks, which is why you talk about things like extra taxes for the energy sector. Move a step further and generate the money to be able to install the right things in people's houses. And suddenly you're not giving the money to corporates who avoid taxation. You're investing in our country. And the last point I'll make on this, there are 5 interconnectors built in Scotland that take our energy from Scotland. They bypass the houses of pensioners who won't be able to afford their heating in winter, and they go down south. Let's stop that. Let's use these things for the people of Scotland first.
Jim Fairlie?
Yeah. So, you asked right at the start if anyone's got a heat pump installed, and we do. But I'm going to caveat that to the point that the gentleman made up there. I've also got a wood-burning stove, because we get power cuts where I live. And it's that, it goes right back to the question that the lady has asked. How do we take our community with us on this journey, which we absolutely have to go?
He wanted to ban wood-burning stoves.
Hold on. Let's just try and... Hold on, Stephen.
New building.
Let's just
you're not
try
going to
and
go for wood burners. He'd still be allowed his backup system.
Let's just try and keep it into a place where we can actually agree on something, because every one of us should be agreeing. And I can tell you, as somebody who's been farming 30 years, I've watched the climate change every year. I watch the seasons change. I've watched the rhythms change. So it's definitely happening. So we have to take it seriously. But how we bring our country with us to say, this is going to have to change, we have to be part of that process. Now, there are things that we can do. The big investments, those huge investments that the UK government could make that would then allow us to do those things. We can take all of that renewable energy that we are producing, 113%, I think it is, of renewable energy right now in Scotland. That will more than power everything that we do here in Scotland, and yet it's getting siphoned away. So there are opportunities. This is a huge challenge, but it's also a huge opportunity that I think we should be grasping.
All right, it's the fastest hour in TV. We are done for this evening. That's it for tonight. We're back with you next week in Kirkcaldy. Have a look on the website for details of how to get involved there, or the following week when we're going to be in Glasgow. If you missed any of tonight's show, we'll repeat it a bit later on BBC One Scotland, or you can watch it any time that suits you on the BBC iPlayer, of course. Thank you very much indeed to my panel here tonight, and our audience here in Perth, and to you at home for watching. We'll see you next week. In the meantime, stay safe, stay well. From all of us in Debate Night, good night.